Welcome to the Branding Room Only podcast, where we share career stories, strategies, and lessons learned on how industry leaders and influencers have built their personal brands. Now, let's get started with the show. Hi, everyone. It's Paula Edgar here, your host of Branding Room Only, where we talk to influencers and industry professionals about their personal brands, how they built them, their reflections on personal branding, and anything else I want to talk about because it's my podcast. So anyway, I'm so excited to have Aliza Shatzman here today with me. She is the president and founder of the Legal Accountability Project, which is a nonprofit aimed at ensuring that law clerks have positive clerkship experiences while extending support and resources to those who do not. We're going to talk much more about how she has why, the how, and the what in just a minute. But as you all know, we've got to get through my important questions, really important questions at the beginning first, and then we jump into the conversation. Aliza, welcome to the Branding Room.
Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Thank you. All right. So we start off with a couple of the same questions. One is, what does a personal brand mean to you? How do you define it?
I think of it as how you promote yourself and how you show up in the world, but it can be quite intentional. It's how you want to show up in the world.
Oh, yes, it can definitely be quite intentional. Hopefully by this time, everybody knows that I expect for all of your brands to be intentional. Okay, how about this? How would you describe yourself in 3 words or phrases?
Tenacious, assertive, persistent.
Oh, I like that.
I have persist tattooed on my wrist, so it works.
And I love it's like my favorite words whenever women use them are assertive and ambitious. I was like,
oh, that too. Give me a 4th word.
Done. Done and done. Okay. Do you have a favorite quote or a motto that you live by or love?
Yes. When there are no ceilings, the sky's the limit. It's a Hillary Clinton quote from her convention speech, and it's tattooed on my left rib. So
wow. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Lots of tattoo references so far.
That's what I was gonna say. I went with my daughter this past holiday break to get her first tattoo. Ooh, that was an interesting thing. I was like, look how I've grown up as a mom from when I turned 18 and got tattoos, and my mother was furious with me. But anywho. All right, so let's talk about, where did you grow up and how did that shape you?
So I grew up in suburban Philadelphia. My parents still live in my childhood home. So I visit them and their puppy in conjunction with like law school events for the Legal Accountability Project. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question you ask because now, of course, there's a lot of foreign policy conflict in the Middle East, the humanitarian crisis in Israel. Mm-hmm. And I'm Jewish, but it's something I don't talk much about, though I have posted a couple times about my grandmother, who's a Holocaust survivor who passed away within the last 2 years. Wow. So I grew up in a progressive and very Jewish community, and I didn't really encounter anti-Semitism. But now, and I mean, since I was in college and in law school, it's become clear that there's a divide between being a progressive, which I don't consider myself a progressive anyway, but being even a Democrat and being supportive of Israel. So it shaped me a lot in that way. My views on foreign policy, my views on religion. I was fortunate to have a lot of privileges, and now, as I'm taking these very, very assertive stances on clerkships and the judiciary, and I have been doing so for several years, I know that I'm in a very privileged position, dating far back to where I grew up. I was privileged to pursue the career I wanted because my parents paid for law school and I had no loans, for example. So it gave me great privilege. And I think that with privilege comes a responsibility to use it in a way that benefits others.
Oh, with privilege comes responsibility. Yes, yes, and all of the yeses. I just did a presentation where I was talking about how privilege impacts language, right? What things that we say, things that we assume, and the getting people to understand the concept of privilege it's one challenge, but then understanding the responsibility that I think comes from it is another one. And so I love that you leveraged that and elevated that in terms of the conversation, because I do think that should we care about equity and advancing like fairness, that there's a responsibility for those who have and those who don't to navigate differently. So, all right. So you've already then said that you were an advocate and you were doing all of these things. Tell me how you got here. What's been your professional journey?
So I graduated from WashU Law in 2019, 5 years ago. I aspired to be a homicide prosecutor in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office.
Mhm.
So I decided to clerk in DC Superior Court during the 2019 term.
Mhm.
That is the jurisdiction where I wanted to practice law.
Mhm.
And the messaging around clerkships at my law school, like at all law schools, is just uniformly positive. This is going to be a lifelong mentor-mentee relationship. This position will confer only professional benefits. So I pursued a clerkship to check off that necessary box. As we'll probably talk about, I had a very negative experience where I was harassed, fired, retaliated against by a now former judge. I filed a judicial complaint and pursued the limited avenues of redress available to me,
Mhm.
and then began to advocate for workplace protections and judicial accountability
Mhm.
to correct injustices I experienced as a law student and a law clerk. So I did not graduate from law school intending to like launch and lead a judicial accountability focused nonprofit, yet here I am. And not to, not to put too fine a point on it, but like, I don't know, I think I was kind of born to do this type of work.
Mhm.
And the response has been very positive. And as we've talked about, with privilege comes responsibility to advocate. And so that's what I'm doing now.
First of all, there's I don't know, this is kind of like joy that I get when people are advocating. Like when you know something is wrong and you're doing something about it, because it's not just there's a lot of people who know something's wrong and do nothing about it, right? it it is when I think about the brand piece of this, which is to say, here's the winds that are blowing against me, and here I am coming right back at them. And that is hard. That is hard. And so hard in that you have to be able to say, like, I got to do something I know people are not going to love, right? But that I know that's important to get done. And so, number one, thank you, because there's a privilege that happens whenever there are discriminatory issues, whenever there's sexual harassment, whenever there's any kind of harassment. And I practice in labor and employment law. So I've talked about this in a lot of spaces. And a part of that is the actual position, like the position that you have and the privilege that it affords, and people then using that power and privilege to impact others detrimentally. So I want to hear what and how, what your experience was, and how that brought us to being here.
Yeah, I definitely will go into that. But I did want to say,
Yeah.
It is hard work every day, even though the response has been very positive, because there are always going to be people who are very, very invested in maintaining the status quo.
Mhm.
Some of these law school clerkship directors and deans, some of these judges are so entrenched. They hate the word entrenched, but it is the appropriate word.
Mhm.
So the headwinds are very much against change. But, I identified an enormous void, an unmet need, and a real hunger for candid dialogue about the judiciary.
Mhm.
And as we're going to talk about the branding aspect, I mean, my brand is these strong accountability related statements, and yet the response is so overwhelmingly positive, showing that there really is a desire. What's hard is the handful of people who push back. But as we're going to talk about my own experience, I never for 1 second doubted that I would file a complaint, that I would try to hold this judge accountable.
Mhm.
And I've never for 1 second doubted that I'm doing the right thing, that my mission to correct these injustices is right, is just, that we are doing right. And I've just never doubted that. So I think that's kind of what galvanizes me, despite the fact that it's hard.
Yeah.
And sometimes it makes it hard to empathize with those who do not want to speak out. And I know that I need to do better, but it is hard when clerks tell me every day that they're mistreated and they will never file a complaint, tell their law school, warn other clerks, speak out. They're perpetuating these problematic behaviors. And that's not the most sensitive thing to say. And I'm sure there's some people who don't love me saying that, but it doesn't make it less true. I'm fine taking on a lot of the risk, taking on a lot of the blowback. Not that there's so much, but it's hard.
Yeah.
But it's sad when others won't step up to the plate too. And so,
Yeah. And I think everyone's individual and also collective experience to the point of who you're trying to help. The way, I mean, we all know this from just like having experienced a global pandemic together, like the way we navigate trauma, it's individually different and collectively different as well, and in silos. And so I hear you. I think there's so much injustice right now in so many different ways in our society that it is hard to, number one, speak up because I think everybody's exhausted. I think everybody is like, oh, child, there is so many things that are going on. But on the other hand, it is, I think, spirit sucking to not identify
exactly.
what something is.
Yes.
So never and all in a victim blaming, but also in a what that we need to collectively garner ourselves as much as we can, right? To the extent that we can to make change in little spaces and big spaces, which is what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I could never have stayed silent when all these clerks tell me they don't run a report. It's like, if you don't report, they'll never be held accountable. They'll just continue on with their bad behavior. And that could never, ever sit right with me. And when I see mistreated clerks and how the experience weighs on them years, decades later, I just try to convey how much better they'll feel, how healing it is to speak out, and how empowering. So, yeah.
So talk to me about
Yeah.
as much as you would like to share in terms about your experience and then how that led to the Legal Accountability Project.
Yeah, so I did all the things my law school instructed me to. I applied broadly and accepted the first clerkship I was offered. And while I, of course, tried to do my research about the judge I'd be clerking for, there just wasn't much information available about him, like with most judges. So I started clerking in August 2019, and unfortunately, it went downhill very quickly. The judge would kick me out of the courtroom and tell me that I made him uncomfortable and that he just felt more comfortable with my male co-clerk. He told me I was bossy and aggressive and that I had personality issues. The day I found out I passed the DC bar exam, big day in my life, he calls me into his chambers, gets in my face and says, "You're bossy." And I know bossy because my wife is bossy.
Jeez.
This is, of course, all stuff that would only be said about a woman. I was devastated. This was my first job out of law school. This judge was clearly singling me out for mistreatment. I remember crying myself to sleep at night, crying on the walk to work in the morning. I wished I could be reassigned to another judge. My workplace did not allow for that to happen. I confided in some attorney mentors and they advised me to stick it out. So I tried because I knew I needed a full year of work experience to be eligible to work as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. The entire reason I'd accepted this terrible clerkship. During the pandemic, we transitioned to remote work. I moved back to Philly to stay with my parents. And the judge ignored me for 6 weeks before he called me up and told me he was firing me because I made him uncomfortable and lacked respect for him. But he didn't want to get into it. And he hung up on me.
Wow.
So then I tried to use the limited channels that I thought were available to me, called DC Courts HR. They told me there was nothing they could do. HR doesn't regulate judges. Judges and law clerks have a unique relationship. Then they told me I should have known I was an at-will employee. So then I reached out to my law school, WashU Law, seeking, I guess, advice or support. And I found out the judge had a history of harassing his clerks that law school administrators, including the clerkships director, who still works there, and several professors knew about when I'd accepted the clerkship. And they had decided not to share that information with me because they wanted another student to clerk. This is obviously all really devastating. I connected with some professors and a judge who directed me to file a complaint or directed me to where I would, decided to wait to file it because I was worried the judge would retaliate against me. So I thought, wait till I have a new job. Takes me about a year to get back on my feet. Of course, as I interviewed for jobs, people asked, like, why did your clerkship end early? Why isn't the judge a reference? Secured my dream job in the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, moved back to DC in the summer of 2021 I imagine I would have put all this behind me. I was 2 weeks into training. I'd already started working there when I received some really devastating news that altered the course of my life. I was told the judge had made negative statements about me on my background investigation, that I wouldn't be able to obtain a security clearance, and that my job offer was being revoked.
Wow.
So I remember crying on the phone with USAO leadership, DC courts leadership. Nobody would tell me what the judge had said. They just said the decision was final. So I filed a complaint, hired attorneys, and participated in the investigation into the now former judge. Partway through that, we found out he was already under investigation and on administrative leave for other misconduct, which the U.S. Attorney's Office was never alerted about. My complaint was dismissed. The judge was removed from the bench for other reasons, and we pursued private settlement negotiations. I received a copy of the outrageous negative reference that had led to the revocation of my job offer. And then in January 2022, the judge issued a clarifying statement addressing some of his outrageous claims about me. By then, the damage had been done. It had been too long, and I was pretty much blackballed from what I thought was my dream job. And I share this experience a lot now on law school campuses, podcasts, legal scholarship, everywhere. And I always seek to underscore that my negative experience is not rare, but it is one that is rarely shared publicly due to the culture of silence and fear surrounding the judiciary.
Oh,
yeah. How that relates to what I'm doing now is that I was going through the judicial complaint process that summer, and I discovered that law clerks are exempt from Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Folks like me cannot sue our harassers and seek damages, which is outrageous. Yeah. So there is pending legislation called the Judiciary Accountability Act that would correct this injustice for 31,000 judiciary employees. So I reached out to House and Senate judiciary offices to advocate for the legislation. And when a House Judiciary hearing happened in March 2022, I submitted written testimony advocating for the legislation. And in the weeks following that, the response was very positive, which I appreciated because previous law clerks had testified before Congress and the response was not so positive. So I began thinking about some ideas to further my advocacy work on behalf of clerks, which led me to launch the nonprofit to correct injustices I experienced as a student and clerk. And it's really based on increasing access to candid, transparent information about judicial clerkships, premised on conversations with several dozen law school deans and clerkship directors about the resources they use to help students get information about judges, find a good clerkship, avoid judges who mistreat their clerks. And spoiler alert, regardless of where you go to law school, there is no information about judges accessible to students right now, which is a real injustice for aspiring attorneys.
Wow. Oh, so okay, that was a lot. I want to go back a bit and just call something out, because obviously I am so sorry that you had the experience that you had, and it just reminded me of something that I always share, and I share it kind of flippantly, about an experience that I had when I was in law school interviewing with a judge. I went on an interview to be a judicial intern, and I showed up, and I remember I had gone shopping, and I got in this nice suit at Macy's. It was a pantsuit. I looked good. And I get there, and it was at the lunch break, and he was talking to someone, he was on, on the dais, and was talking to somebody, and then he looks at me, and he looks at his court attorney and says, "If that's my interviewee, tell her to come back when she's in a dress."
Yeah.
And I remember looking at this woman being like, "What?" And she was like, "Yeah, you have to come back." And I didn't go back. but to that end, I didn't even think like this is something I have to say something about at school. There was so much, and imagine having a resource such as this one, even acknowledgement that wild things like this can happen and have happened, and to have an understanding that there are avenues that you can take, and there are ways in which to hold people accountable. And accountability is one of my favorite words, because I want it, and I believe in being accountable. It just makes everything better, even when it's hard. But I can imagine that there are a lot of things happening just because my work is primarily with the legal profession anyway, that when I was doing on my own, working as a consultant, investigations or even training, there would be so many times where people would say, we have a bad actor. They need individual training, but they're a rainmaker.
Yep.
So not getting rid of them, but they need training. And so a part of it is like the accountability is to stop having this person be, leashed on other people, but instead it was that we want to put a band-aid on it. And it really is one of the reasons why I was interested in having you come on the podcast, because your experience in particular, look at how what you experienced impacted you and your brand and your ability to do what you wanted to do.
Yes.
To that end, yes, I think you are the right person at the right time to do this work, but your trajectory was impacted by someone's bad acting, and there was no accountability. Well, there was eventually accountability, but not accountability and enough people talking about it to prevent you from even having that experience. And so I say all of that because I know some people might be like, well, why? Like, why is Paula having Aliza on the podcast? It's because this happens all the time.
Yes. Yes.
All
Yes.
the time.
It is pervasive in the judiciary and judicial clerkships. It is pervasive in the legal profession.
Mm-hmm.
And we treat judges as untouchable. I mean, federal judges can only be removed by congressional impeachment, which is exceedingly rare.
Mm-hmm.
But law clerks so rarely even file a judicial complaint under the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act. They so rarely speak up. It weighs heavily on me that I hear about hundreds of judges mistreating their clerks who will never be held accountable. And I feel so strongly about everything you just said because, look, there are judges now who will say to intern and clerk candidates, like, come back when you're wearing a dress. I know about them, and nobody calls them out. And I think the perception in the legal profession, even among some judges who generally do the right thing, is that you give up a lot to work as a law clerk. You shouldn't have to give up anything. You shouldn't have to give up any part of yourself to work as a law clerk or a judicial intern. I think it's crazy that that perception is out there and that judges are not told to stop it and improve. And yeah, the perception is always like, oh, we can train them. Well, training in the federal judiciary is optional. And there is no real accountability. There is no, discussion about like appointing better judges. I mean, I think about my experience, and somebody said to me the day after the judge who mistreated me was removed from the bench, like, Aliza, I'm sorry about what happened to you, but it's too bad we're losing a progressive sentencer in Washington, D.C., as if they could not find another judge to appoint who is a progressive sentencer. That is ridiculous. That is the perception in the legal profession right now. The judges are just untouchable. They're above the laws they enforce. And the first step toward accountability is shining like sunlight, transparency on this bad behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we see, to your point, across industries that bad actors are often prioritized because of their impact and their skill set, et cetera, and deprioritizing very often women who also have a skill set and who also should be prioritized, because we have gender inequity. Like, with there's so much going on societally around the treatment of women and how women are listened to and heard and how their experiences are elevated. And it's one of the things that I am passionate about when I think about my own brand and really being focused on women and uplifting women and making sure that women are heard and then they have voices that they use in very assertive ways and with all the ambition in the world, and to make change, because then if not us, then who, right? And then what are we then continuing to teach and promote if we don't do that? At some point it has to stop, or at least we need to say we know this is happening. Because I think, to your point, shining the light is the first step. People have to understand that you can't hide behind a robe, a tie, or whatever you're wearing, that you are not untouchable, and you shouldn't be. But we have lots of issues with power and privilege societally that impact the way people feel like they are able to go out and about and do what the hell they want and treat people any old way without accountability. And that's bad branding and that's bad news. And that's why I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. So, okay, talk to me about, I think I want to jump. What advice would you give to law students or young lawyers right now in terms of thinking about how they can make a difference? And if specifically if they're thinking about what you're talking about, like judicial accountability, wanting to be in the space, but wanting to make sure it's a space that's safe or brave for them, like what advice would you give to them as they entered into or wanted to proceed with maybe perhaps doing a clerkship or making change in some way?
Yeah. Well, in terms of making change,
Mhm.
if you identify an unmet need, a void, an injustice, I mean, take the leap. Don't wait for somebody else to fix it. Like, fix it yourself. Because if
Mhm.
you see a problem, others are seeing a problem too. And
Mhm.
we have a legal profession wide intransigence of just kind of like looking around and assuming somebody else will fix it. Well,
Mhm.
no, you've got to fix it. So
Mhm.
that is definitely the advice for anyone thinking about making change. I mean, the legal profession is so cautious. That's been one of my most disheartening discoveries since
Mhm.
becoming an attorney.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I would have become one if I'd known that, 7, 8 years ago. It's really sad.
Mhm.
There's just a real risk aversion and an aversion to accountability.
Mhm. Mhm.
So when I think of law students, and I spend a lot of time on law school campuses for the Legal Accountability Project's programming and advocacy work, and there's a lot of awesome student advocacy on a whole host of issues.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then everybody just goes to a law firm and just like puts on their little corporate suit and does like corporate work and just stays really quiet and doesn't ruffle any feathers. And it makes me so sad. Like, where does that advocacy minded spirit go? And I
Mhm.
think some people say, well, they get to do pro bono work. And hey, I love LAP's pro bono counsel. We have two wonderful law firms representing us, and that's great. But that's like a small part of their work. It makes
Mhm.
me sad that more people aren't pursuing that kind of like advocacy and change making work. So if
Yeah.
you want to do it, I mean, friggin' do it. Don't wait 5 years to pay off your loans. Don't wait, just do it.
Yes, and I do, I always have to, there's a just do it part of it that I think I align and agree with you. And I also know that in addition to challenges I mentioned before, that there are some people who don't have the privilege of just doing it, right? Like they have to pay the loans off, and they have to think about the impact. But to that end, I do think that no matter where we are, whatever our responsibilities are, there is some, even if you just share your story, like if something has happened to you, so that it doesn't happen to the next person, right? Then that is a way of advocating and of changing things versus the silence. And I also, I know because I always get people who, will send me messages, posts, listen to the podcast. I also know that yes, we don't like risk as a profession, don't like risk. And I think people in general are not, they don't love risk, but the people who are the change agents, they understand that there's a little bit or a lot of bit of risk in whatever they do. And speaking out and actually saying, I'm not going to wait is one way. Supporting organizations that are doing the work is another way. Sharing information, which is why I wanted to do the podcast, is another way. So, we're having this conversation. I don't want everybody to think they have to like take off their suit and march outside and be like, rah, rah, rah. You can if you like. But but that's, the advocacy has many different shapes and forms. The point is that we have to do less of kind of sitting and saying, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. I hate when lawyers say that. It's particularly, I'm like, well, if not us, then who's going to do something? Because
Yeah.
we're the ones who change the laws, and we're the ones who create terrible laws, and we're the one. Like, there's
Yeah.
all of these things in there. And so I'll jump down off of my soapbox and and just say, do something, to your point, as opposed to doing nothing. Share
And
this
the
podcast. How about that? Like,
And the interesting thing is that a lot of people's personal brands are very tied to their clerkships, which
yeah.
is fine, except that the way they message them is uniformly positive and therefore dishonest.
Mhm.
Because, like right now, today, LAP has gotten a bunch of people to like en masse share
Mhm.
information about our work on LinkedIn. So we have this
Mhm.
real campaign going. So it's
Mhm.
not just me with my like very strong
Mhm.
statements.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there's some people who I know did not have positive clerkship experiences who, while sharing information about LAP's work, are
Mhm.
still talking about their very positive clerkship experiences and why
Mhm.
clerking is the best thing you can do with your life.
Mhm.
And that makes me sad. And, as we talked about, not everybody is in a position to share a very negative experience so publicly like I do.
Mhm.
But it's dishonest and it's a
Mhm.
disservice to students looking to attorneys for information, who are role models, who are approaching these former clerks and saying, well, was your experience positive? I'm applying to the judge you clerked for. So to withhold that information is just so wrong.
Mhm.
And my messaging is very much that everybody should consider clerking, but that you have to be mindful about who you clerked for in a way you currently cannot be due to the lack of transparent information. But there are, of course, judges I dissuade people from clerking for. And it's sad that so few people are willing to take that next step and say, not every judge is somebody you should clerk for. We
Mhm.
are changing the culture through statements like mine and LAP's work, but there is a lot of work to be done. I mean, the messaging is just bad.
Yeah. It's kind of like it's like an untouchables, right? Kind of where it's like, and when you think about why it's important, clearly, but why it's even more important, like, these are the people who are in charge of bringing justice, right? They are the filter between the constituent and the justice that's supposed to be. And so if they are not even, you know, good people, for lack of a very, like, not to be scientific, but good people
Yep.
in who they work with and who they are supposed to be helping to foster in their careers, then how does that extend to the justice they're supposed to be providing externally too? Because it makes me think about their values and right and who and how they show up. And that for me as a layperson is scary. It's why I think that we should care, right? That we should be very thoughtful about this because yes, of course, it's the experiences of people, but it's also we need to have an understanding that the people who are not doing the work in the way that it should be done are problematic and we need to hold them accountable. Oh,
Exactly.
wow.
If you are mistreating your clerks,
Mhm.
you are showing your true self when nobody is watching. What does that say about how you treat litigants? And look, what
Mhm.
is a female like a Title VII litigant to think if she knows the judge is mistreating their clerks? They are not subject to Title VII themselves. I mean, it sends a message to the public when we do not hold judges accountable that these people are basically above the laws that they interpret and enforce.
Mhm.
It is really, really troubling.
Oh, okay. Well, I want to pivot for a little bit. In talking about your advocacy and really thinking about the values that you clearly have and wanting to shine a light on wrongdoing and to have better experiences for folks who are considering working as clerks. How do you align your personal brand with that value proposition and still also maintain that professional integrity and your ethics? There's a lot of ways that people go wrong in our profession and other professions, but what is your driving force in terms of doing this?
Is a great question. It's one I think about a lot.
Mhm.
So I launched the Legal Accountability Project 19 months ago,
Mhm.
and I knew that my experience would be very closely tied not only to my personal brand that I was building, but to
Mhm.
the Legal Accountability Project's work. And so it is all very enmeshed. Is my very negative personal experience tied to the Legal Accountability Project, which we are a transparency and accountability and a diversity nonprofit. But
Mhm.
of course, accountability is in the title. Of course, that is clearly what drives me.
Mhm.
And then our clerkships database, our legal tech initiative to democratize information about judges,
Mhm.
is also very enmeshed with those two things.
Mhm.
So I think a lot about how I am sharing my experience while also doing this work,
Mhm.
while talking about my negative experience while still encouraging students to clerk. And so I
Mhm.
think what drives me is, of course, my personal values, my quest for justice, for
Mhm.
accountability, for transparency. So that's what drives me. That's what drives the nonprofit. There are times many times, when I swallow my personal feelings
Mhm.
to engage with people I find unpalatable or challenging.
Mhm.
You work with any judge or court that's willing to engage with us.
Mhm.
We work with any law school that is. And some of these judges and some of these law school clerkship directors and deans are just saying outrageous things about me, about the nonprofit,
Mhm.
but we want to help as many clerks and students as possible. And so we work with them.
Mhm.
I think there is probably a public perception
Mhm.
that, of course, Aliza's personal values are totally aligned with the nonprofit. And so she never has like an ethical conflict or a moral qualm.
Mhm.
I subjugate my personal feelings to the goals of the nonprofit every hour of every day
Mhm.
because I know there's so many students and clerks to help and that the goals of the nonprofit are bigger than myself.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that is hard, whenever you have an initiative that you're trying to bring light to or get support for, it is helpful mostly when you can align your personal experience with it. It also can be challenging when you have to align your personal experience with it. And, I think we resonate with stories more than we resonate with we should, right? Right. We want to hear, like, we resonate with the fact that we can connect to some part of the lack of justice. We can connect to some part of the pain that you must feel from having that experience or the unfairness of all of that. And so that aligning should happen, but it is also challenging when people equate you with the thing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, and when I was thinking about launching this nonprofit and looking around at some of the advocates who were in the space or adjacent to the space, I really felt strongly nobody was advocating based on their personal experience. That's what set us apart, and that was what was so important. Nobody can empathize with clerks and students the way I do because nobody else has had and publicly shared and then advocated based on their personal experience. So I thought that was so important. I always wonder how much of the time should be spent sharing my experience versus uplifting others' experiences. We get that question a lot.
Right.
At the end of the day, I speak with a lot of clerks who are all right sharing their experience in the clerkships database, but who are not going to, speak publicly, and that's okay. So I try to speak for them when I advocate. But I do think the personal experience is certainly what got me in the door in the initial 3 to 6 month period with like 80 law schools worth of clerkship directors and deans. They knew my experience. They knew I was advocating based on it. They suspected I was probably engaging with them in good faith, or at least based on like, real injustices I wanted to correct.
Yeah.
I still think now it's important to share the experience. And right after we launched the nonprofit, we went on this big fixing our clerkship system tour of like between 20 and 30 law schools. And I would always share my personal experience and still do because I wanted to change the messaging around clerkships. Nobody had ever heard really of a negative experience before hearing mine. And so it was important just to like set the groundwork for the issues we needed to correct so that people were clear-eyed about asking the right questions before clerking.
Right.
But I wanted to make sure we also were coming to students with solutions, coming to law schools with solutions. We weren't just perceived as out there complaining.
Right.
And so we did with this clerkships database. But at the end of the day, I think many people who hear my experience just find it, empowering to hear me speak because it resonates so broadly with so many people across industries. And so I think it's important to share that too. Of course, my experience is very closely tied to why I launched the nonprofit. Someone said to me recently, if you'd had the clerkship experience people dream about, you'd be a homicide prosecutor right now. There'd be no LAP. And that's interesting and sad. And I like to think I would have found my way to advocating on these issues anyway. But it's just important to make it clear that the story, the experience is important, but it's not everything. I use my experience to ground the work, but the work is much larger than me. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as we close, I'm going to pivot to three questions that I ask everyone, because my word of the year and my ethos period is always joy. And so it is clear to me that being in a space of advocacy and living the truth that is true to you is a part of what drives you, and hopefully sometimes at least brings you joy. But I have questions.
It often brings me joy. Yes.
Then what do you do for fun?
I work out every day.
Mhm.
I'm on the elliptical every single day, listening to music and podcasts.
Mhm.
And I'm also an aspiring dog owner. Right now, I'm just a friend of all the dogs in the building. But this will be the year that Aliza gets a dog or two dogs.
Aliza, the aspiring dog owner. I love that. Um, I am aspiring to not have anybody in my house besides me and my husband, but I'm still working on getting the rest of them out. So anyway, okay. So question I ask everybody is stand by your brand, which I think we kind of probably already covered, but I'm going to ask it in specific anyway. What is the authentic aspect of your personal brand that you'll never compromise on?
This is something I think about a lot. And I know we didn't talk too much about the personal brand. So I would encourage people to check out my LinkedIn
Mhm.
primarily, but also my Twitter to see what I've posted every single day for almost 2 years about accountability and transparency in clerkships and the judiciary.
Mhm.
It is clear that I am making strong accountability focused statements. And
Mhm.
that is what drives me. I will never compromise on that.
Mhm.
LAP is different things to different people. We do important transparency and DEI work for
Mhm.
improving the clerkship system. That is all important. But at the
Mhm.
end of the day, I will always be out there at least every day or two, making a very strong accountability statement directed at either law schools or the judiciary or the legal profession.
Mhm. I mean, at a minimum, that at least allows for folks who may not be getting the information or support that they need to know that there are resources out there, so that now at least the Google imprint of if you have been wronged or if you have questions can lead in a different space than it may have before when you were trying to find information and couldn't,
Good.
or there was no
Yeah.
right. Like
Good
so
point.
that's
Yes.
important. It's important.
Yes.
I always say I am unapologetically an advocate for Black lawyers. I'm also unapologetically an advocate for women lawyers. But there's a lot, like my values are part of my brand statement. Like there's no silence. Like you also will know that I love Prince. Like there's just a lot of things that are a part of who I am. And I think it resonates more for people that they feel like it's that thing and they care about it because of you, and also that thing they might look at differently because of your connection to it, which is what influence is, which is what having a strong brand is.
And we are proud that if you Google clerkship information now, LAP's clerkships database is one of the first search results.
Fabulous. And we absolutely will be putting the links to everything in the show notes so that folks can have access and hopefully continue to share. So branding room only is a play on standing room only, which is, when you go to a concert or go see something when everybody wants to be in the room. What is your magic? What is the experience that you bring that people would be standing in the room for because you're going to experience it about you?
Oh, that is a good question. And we've had standing room only events for the Legal Accountability Project at some of these law
Yeah.
schools.
Yes.
I am a very dynamic speaker. I mean, that
Mhm.
might sound too whatever, but I can hold a crowd. I think it is empowering and electrifying to hear me speak, especially when I have the hand gestures going. Definitely don't need a mic.
Mhm.
We are proud of that. We are proud that our programming is really different,
Mhm.
that it is unique.
Well, tell everybody how they can find you. What's the best way to connect with the Legal Accountability Project and or with you? And we'll obviously be putting links in the show notes, but I love to include it in the voice just in case no one runs back to the show notes.
Our website is legalaccountabilityproject.org. So you can join our mailing list, stay up to date, donate, get information about our clerkships database. I'm very accessible on social media, particularly LinkedIn and Twitter, but we run all the social media platforms now or via email. And people should reach out. If you clerked, you should share your clerkship experience with us. And if you're a law student, you should urge your law school to participate in this clerkships database. But whether you're an attorney or not, and whether you clerked or not, everybody can and should be part of the solution here.
Mhm. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Everybody, tell someone about this, like, but to the point of us making sure things get a light. I know many of my listeners are lawyers or lawyer adjacent, right? That means we know people who are thinking about or have or considering being a lawyer or perhaps clerking. it's really important for us to love each other and to protect each other. And so this is one of the ways we can do so in holding folks accountable and shining the light. Thank you so much for being on the Branding Room podcast. Bye.
Yeah.